To share this. As Andy sort of realized, and I realized as we were going over this our last meeting, we were like, wow, we actually did make some real progress, and it was super exciting. And even though it feels like we kept having these meetings and we're like, oh, I kind of poked along. So I want to sort of give you that scope and tell the story of where we're at, and point to where we're hoping to get to by May or next. So as Renata said, this is the program assessment subgroup. And now I have to, okay, so we were sort of aiming for an end delivery in May. And the summary of sort of our recent progress is that we really spent a lot of time narrowing the scope of what exactly we want to be producing as our working document. And we also wanted to, and we've been doing some sort of work about actually putting a framework around what that scope and assessment is going to look like. Some of the challenges that we are still aware of and are hopefully we'll have some chance to sort of mitigate as we move through in the spring is sort of making sure that we actually have produced supporting documentation and details and processes so others besides us that have spent a lot of time thinking about it can use it. And also sort of a worry that perhaps what we have focused on is either too narrow for other people to use or isn't able to be incorporated into their needs, or that what we have is potentially too complicated for others to be using easily and quickly. So let me give you a deeper insight into what we've actually been doing. So our original charge was, or as I at least proposed it when we first proposed the group, was to develop some sort of tool, product, or process that would help data programs improve or even implement from the get-go some kind of program level assessment. So thinking about a college or university's degree program, and that degree programs as part of good practice and part of accreditation processes and things like that have to do program level assessment of program learning outcomes, things that students are learning in their subclasses, et cetera. And recognizing that as programs are coming online, they need to have something that they can pick up and use and do this with, and that perhaps many of the faculty that are designing these programs either don't have time because they're too busy running around trying to get new courses out, et cetera, or maybe don't have the knowledge to do a good plan for how they're going to be tackling assessment of their learning outcomes. So this is sort of really big, broad scope. And we knew when we proposed this that we weren't going to be able to tackle producing a program level assessment plan for every program out there, no matter what they had. So we started with sort of talking about the different possible focuses that we believed would show up in almost every program in some way or form. And those consisted of either technical outcomes. So this could be things like various descriptions of data wrangling, machine learning knowledge. It could be database knowledge, things like this. So they very much focused on technical skills or technical knowledge that they needed to have. There's also professional outcomes. And so this could be things like presenting to clients. It could be how you write. It could be how you work as a team, et cetera. And then taking the language from the ACM data science curriculum guides, there's also sort of disposition outcomes. And so those are things like ethics. So students approaching data science in an ethical manner. It could be about knowing data privacy laws. It could be about sort of the term that was put into the National Science Academy's report, which is data acuity. So those are all things that we could have focused on. Now, that's a lot. And again, we said we couldn't do it all. So what did we go? And apparently it's not, why is it not showing? All right, hang on. I'm going to put it back up onto this one. So what we decided to do to figure this out was we did a quick case study of existing learning outcomes from basically from the group members' programs, data science programs that they were involved in. So yes, limited scope, but we figured that was enough of a perspective to figure out what people were actually doing so that we might be able to have a good idea of what fit into those spaces. From looking at those learning outcomes, we grouped them into things that were similar, and then we picked 2 topics out of that we thought we would make the most sense to focus on, which were communicating with others and ethics and professional behavior. We felt that we could sort of move on from the technical outcomes that most programs or faculty were going to be far more comfortable assessing things like technical outcomes, and they were going to be assessing some of these other pieces, especially if faculty were coming from a very technical field such as computer science or mathematics or statistics. And so hopefully providing some support in the other places would make more sense. So now let's see if I can actually get to the next slide. Nope. All right, we're gonna go this way. So what we ended up doing was, as a group, we wrote a generic program learning outcome. We are all well aware that if you read this, you're going to be like, whoa, that's a giant program learning outcome. This is not something that we would actually expect a degree program to use as their program learning outcome, because it is way too complex and way too inclusive. But what we wanted was something that was that covered all of the things that might go into one of those 2 topics, so that when we sort of wrote the assessment, people could pick and choose a little bit of those pieces that made sense. So the generic learning outcome we came up with was communicate about the data, models, and methods and results of the analysis, including the use of appropriate context, limitations, biases, to audience of varying technical expertise through written, oral, and visual means. I'm going to give everyone a minute to sort of read that and process it, because there's a lot there. So feel free to reread, think. Okay. Second pause is, does anyone have any questions about that generic learning outcome before I keep going? Because I do want to make sure that people kind of see what it is and what it covers before we talk about what we're going to be doing to assess it. Because if you don't get the scope, then the next piece is just going to be sort of like noise to you. That's not going to help you.
So Karl, this is Mark. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems that you want the student to be able to communicate on all the phases of the data science life cycle, correct? Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. This is trying to sort of articulate all of those pieces, the data life science cycle. So kind of what comes in, what they do, what comes out. And then we also sort of wanted to make sure that they were thinking about conceptual pieces around that, right? That's the context, limitations, biases. And then we also were capturing all audiences, technical, non-technical, and all different communication mechanisms, such as written, oral, and visual. And like you said, it's covering all of it, recognizing that programs might choose to articulate some set of this, or that the actual learning outcome stated for a program might be more simple, although in the end, it might actually encompass most of this.
And when you talk about the different level of expertise, you mean the one that are specified in the SCN document, tier 1 to tier 3?
No. So when we say varying technical expertise, we're talking about like knowledge of data and coding versus domain knowledge and things like that. And I'll actually The next slide will actually expand that, what we mean by varying technical expertise a little bit in more detail.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So overall, the group decided that sort of our big picture recommended assessment process is that we think that students should create some kind of portfolio of artifacts around each of these communication things that then could be evaluated and assessed by program faculty. And so that sort of leaves a couple of places where our subgroup can continue to do work and flesh out pieces. And I'm going to sort of go into those, right? So in particular, a program needs to define it for itself what categories of desired communication skills or practices they want to see their students exhibit. And then we also need to have sort of the ways in which they plan to assess those. So let's take a look at what we have sort of framed out to sort of talk about this. So our first pass for a sample execution of this assessment design is we built out a nice little table here that we thought mostly captures the broad swaths of ways in which you could articulate different audiences for communication about data. So you can see there, it's a nice little grid that says cross one is domain expertise or no domain expertise. That's across our X horizontal, because throughout almost all of the design, all of the curricular literature for data science, domain knowledge is regularly acknowledged as something that needs to be considered as part of data science student skills. We also know, sort of kind of obviously, right, that like having data expertise is part of the skills that data scientists need to have. And for our purposes, we have decided to group coding and data expertise together. Again, recognizing that a particular program might choose to do something slightly different with this. Using this as our grid of sort of knowledge that people have. And so in this case, we can see a group of people that have domain expertise and coding and data expertise. So that might be data science teams at a big company. It might be specific scientists that are working on a project, things like that. So these are people that have expertise in all of those pieces for whatever the content is. But we could also imagine that there are people that have high levels of either coding or data expertise. This might be data engineers, it might be software implementers or developers, but they don't know the specific domain that's going on. So if you're talking about some kind of biology application or whatever, or bioinformatics thing, maybe they know nothing about biology. Their job is just to implement the app on the phone so that the biologist can use it to do their thing. And they need to know software, but they don't know the domain. We also imagined a group of people that might have domain expertise, but not as much coding or data expertise. Examples of this might be managers or CEOs or people like bosses of the data science teams that perhaps know something about data, but not really enough to like know the processes that are happening. And there's also large swaths of scientists that are highly intelligent, have lots of domain expertise, but simply don't have a lot of experience working in code or working in data. And then there's, for lack of a better idea, the general public, we are sort of articulating as having no domain expertise or no coding expertise, which is not to say that they don't know things or aren't interested or aren't smart, but rather that the way in which we communicate with them would be different. Based on these four categories in our sort of sample execution or sample assessment design, we then wrote out what might fit into that portfolio for a student to demonstrate that they are able to communicate to all of these groups of people. And we actually have quite a few additional ones, but this is sort of a nice little summary list that captures a nice shorter portfolio that might fit for this. So the idea here being that a senior graduating out of a program, a data science program or data analytics program, would have collected through their coursework examples of them doing each of these pieces. And then perhaps through the capstone course or as part of an exit process, they would submit the portfolio for faculty assessment, not as a grade necessarily, but for program purposes. Those things include things like a code and documentation repository. Think a GitHub repo, but it could be something else. Again, we're not over specifying here. We could be talking about a data storyboard or map. And in both of those cases, they're fitting multiple categories, right? Like code and documentation are probably being conveyed to data teams, other scientists, but also to software developers that might need to implement the software things, ideas that they've done. We also could narrow pieces down, like a client-facing presentation is probably headed to people that don't have code, but they need to practice and be able to articulate in domain. But we also wanted to articulate internal pieces like peer review or code review and feedback responses, or bigger pictures like having practice visualization. So this sort of provides all of the framework for what would come out of an assessment for this sort of communication learning outcome. However, we aren't done yet. So that's about where we got to. We've sort of defined what we think a good portfolio might look like. We've defined the process, right? The process is identify what groups you want students to be able to communicate with, determine artifacts that would demonstrate that students can communicate with those groups, and then identify things that will allow you to assess those artifacts. That's the big picture one. Our sample example says, here is how we might define groups. Here is a list of items that would go into that portfolio. What we haven't done for our sample assessment is we haven't done the rubric pieces. And so one of the things that we want to do in the spring is sort of put together some design rubrics or some other processes and things that might allow faculty to assess these outputs that are in our portfolio. We also want to make sure that we've collected sufficient other ideas that faculty can choose the things that they like and want to do. And so we actually have a whole list of a couple of other things that might go into a portfolio and some starts of how they might get assessed. The other piece I think that we need to do is make sure that we put together a good documentation that sort of gives suggested questions for a program or a chair to walk through and say, hey, did you ask this about your program? Did you ask this about what you want and want to assess, etc., so that they can figure out how to walk through and figure out what they want to do for their particular assessment of their particular program or whatever their learning outcome is. And then ideally, the sort of bottom one over here of potential actions or responses to assessment results. It'd be nice to be able to provide, a couple of things that you might say that, oh, hey, we determined that this is, like we assessed our portfolio and we found this deficiency. Here's a couple of ways you might choose to change stuff that you're doing to improve that deficiency or whatever. That's definitely a nice to have, and we'll see where we get to. So, and that is, I believe, the end of what I have to show you. So if there are any questions, I would be happy to take them. It took me a little bit longer than I thought. I think Renata or Kendra thought I was going to talk for, but hopefully it was helpful and interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Karl. I think this is a really good summary of how to assess the piece around communication, which I think is really under-assessed or under-thought about in some cases, even though it's really highly prized by a lot of potential hiring.
Right.
So does anyone have questions or some input into the group around things that you saw or things that you think could be added that would help assess this as well?
So again, this is Mark. So the assessment is for the bachelor in science, in data science, correct?
That has been our primary thought process. But I would say that, and so Karen's on this, and maybe Karen can talk to this because she's mostly thinking about master's and PhD programs. I think that we believe that something in this same vein could be used at a master's or PhD level it was valued as something to have them assessed at, right? Like, because the framework is kind of universal. It's just a matter of how you might choose to, like the rubrics you might choose to implement and or the portfolio items. Like maybe in the portfolio item, you would have a journal article or a conference presentation instead of some of the pieces that we put in there.
Okay, and because I bet they just released in August, the criteria. Did you? So maybe did you try to align or work and what you are doing with the ABET?
So we didn't. Yeah, we didn't. I wasn't aware that ABET had actually finally released their accreditation pieces. What we pulled from were the ACM data science curricular guidelines, and then we cross-referenced that a little bit with some of the other documentation out there that had been published sort of prior to August. I knew ABET was in process, but I wasn't aware that they were done. That's probably a good place to look at, and we can kind of take stock in the spring when we sort of go back and make sure that we're sort of hitting pieces that the ABET articulated or wanted to make sure we're in that accreditation process.
And Karl, so I looked at the ABET standard, and it seems that they did take heavily from the ACM and also from the American Statistical Society. So it would be good to look at, but I don't know that it'll be really far removed.
Right.
But so in some ways that's nice for your rubric. In other ways, but yeah, just taking a look, there may be some tweaks in language from that.
Yeah, I mean, I know that a bunch of the people that were on our ACM task force were also on the ABET task force, and so it should be mostly in line. But it's good. It's always good to cross-reference things before we go out and say, "Hey, use this thing that we made."